race problem in America.
When you say that, a lot of people would disagree with you, and they would say, "How could you say that? You know, maybe maybe it wasn't back then, but you don't know the America today. You know, you don't know what's going on with the challenges they're facing and the level of racism they're experiencing today in the marketplace because maybe you are disconnected, kind of like how you were when you thought everybody was black until you joined the army and you realized that your unit only 8 were black. What do you say to the people that literally 100% disagree with you and they say there is racism today? It is a challenging time today. What do you say to them?
I say, look at the evidence.
Civil rights legend Bob Woodson recently was on the Patrick Bet-David show, and he was talking about a number of factors. So let's watch it and react to some of the things that Bob Woodson said.
Race problem in America.
When you say that, a lot of people would disagree with you, and they would say, "How could you say that? You know, maybe maybe it wasn't back then, but you don't know the America today. You know, you don't know what's going on with the challenges they're facing and the level of racism they're experiencing today in the marketplace because maybe you are disconnected, kind of like how you were when you thought everybody was black until you joined the army and you realized that your unit only 8 were black." What do you say to the people that literally 100% disagree with you and they say there is racism today? It is a challenging time today. What do you say to them?
I say, look at the evidence. Conditions were not like they were back in segregation when I was locked up twice in Mississippi. The conditions have changed, but many of us have. But again, look at the evidence. When whites were at their worst, we were at our best. As I said, in 1930 to 1940, when segregation and racism was enshrined in law, blacks had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. Elderly people could walk safely in those communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. So let's look at the evidence.
Dr. Woodson is so right. People want to talk about how better it was when there was true racism, when there was true discrimination, when there was true oppression happening to black people. People were safer in the black community. They had more resources in the black community. Families were intact in the black community. But nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to say that because they want to buy into this lie that America is systemically racist, that America is full of racism, that white people are running around here trying to attack black people. No, racism is not the problem.
When we refused access to hotels, we built our own hotels, financed by our own means. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and Calvert Hotel in Florida, the St. Charles in Chicago, the St. Teresa in New York. I could go on and on. When we were denied access to colleges, we built our own. And in fact, our small business formation rate was higher than whites in the 20s, and that really determines any group's participation in the economy. It is not what government does for you or what white people do. In fact, I think those who continue to push this race agenda are Eurocentric.
And Dr. Woodson is so on point. That's why I say all the time on this channel, we have agency as people of color. As an American, you have agency. And as a Christian, you have agency. But yet, you have these race hustlers who want us to believe that we don't have agency, that white people determine our destiny, that white people are the center of our existence. That's not the case. Back in the day when black folks couldn't go to places, you see what they did? They built things. But those skills are gone now because people depend more on the government than themselves.
They assume that the destiny of blacks is determined by what white people do. That has never been the case. We closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940. How do we do it? Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, came together with Booker T. Washington, and he put up $4 million. The black community matched it with $4.8 million. We built 5,000 schools to teach ex-slaves how to read and write. And as a consequence of that study, that in between 1920 and 1940, the education gap in the South between whites and blacks was 3 years, 8th grade for whites, 5th grade for blacks. Mm-hmm. Within 20 years, that gap closed within 6 months. There were 5 high schools at the turn of the century in New York, Baltimore, Washington, Atlanta, and New Orleans. They had used textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, half the budgets of white schools, but every one of those schools out-tested every white school in those cities. If we were able to close the education gap between 1920 and 1940 through self-determination and hard work, if we were able to out-test white schools in those cities, then the question is, in those same schools today in Baltimore, for instance, where they're run by blacks, not a single student could read at grade level or perform at grade level. And so how can you say that it is racism that is the cause of the present day challenges?
You can only say that when you have an agenda. You can only say that when you want to use race to destroy this nation. You can only say that when you're disingenuous, when you want people to be looked at as victims so you can profit off of it. That's the only way you can say things like that with a straight face.
In our studies, Red, White, and Black, we looked at the experiences. We looked at 6 major plantations to find out what the state of marriage was of slaves. 75% of those slaves had a man and woman raising children. The nuclear family continued to prosper in the face of segregation for 100 years. But all of that changed in the 60s with the poverty program.
You have to understand that all of that changed under the Great Society, the poverty program. When people tried to social engineer the black community, that's when the nuclear family, the traditional family, was destroyed. That's when fathers were kicked out, and that's when the government came in, and that's when women were incentivized to not be married and have multiple children.
Johnson came in, and what happened was the social scientists who were pushing socialism on America, Cloud and Piven at Columbia, said if you disconnect work from income, then school dropout rates will increase, drug addiction, all of those things. And so what the government did was offer welfare as an alternative to a man in the house. We relaxed the rules. We separated work from income, and as a consequence, that was supported by the Black Power movement. Also, the women's movement was anti-man. And so you had a combination of social policy, but policy alone wouldn't have done it. The federal government enticed welfare to blacks to go on welfare. Blacks' welfare used to be stigmatized in the black community. But the federal government began to interpret it as reparations and as entitlements. They withdrew any requirement that you should tell the paternity of the father, paternity in cases of pregnancy. All of these, so that more blacks came into the welfare system in the first 5 years of the 70s. Then millions flooded into the system at a time when the unemployment rate was under 4%.
Don't you see that? Don't you see the intentional ploy by the federal government to incentivize welfare in the black community? As you heard Dr. Woodson say, welfare was stigmatized in the black community early on. It was stigmatized. People didn't want to go on welfare. They had respect. They had a higher view of themselves and did not want to go on welfare. So what did the government have to do? They had to market the program to women, to feminists, to encourage the welfare system. And that's what we have today.
The nation of social policies plus the civil rights movement morphed into a race grievance industry, and many of those civil rights leaders became mayors and elected to public office, where we spent $22 trillion during that period on programs to aid the poor, where 70 cents of every dollar went not to the poor, but those who served the poor.
What percentage of it?
70%.
70% of the 22 trillion went to the people that serve the poor.
They ask which problems are fundable, not which problems are solvable. So in other words, a friend of mine described it this way. He's having a cabin built in Wisconsin. His electrician is a drunk, and the carpenter is has one leg. Their value to him is their skill. But if he was a disabilities director, their value to him would only be the disability. So we have a situation where we have really created a commodity out of poverty.
A commodity out of poverty.
And by the way, when you're saying these numbers, what it makes me think about is this. So why, if you go back 1940s, you know, the only 4% of kids that were born in America are to a single mother. Okay.
Right.
That increased from 4% to 40%.
Right.
Okay. And the numbers are staggering where it's at today, specifically
70%.
in 70% in blacks and different in, you know, different communities. Why do you think this happened? And, you know, if you were to say, well, here's how we can get away from this, this is how to fix it. So one, why did it happen? How do we get here? Two, how would you fix it?
Well, first of all, we got here because we had the social policy that incentivized single parents. In other words, I had a young couple. She said that my husband, my husband's a janitor and I'm a secretary, and he lost his job. She said, I applied for welfare as a married couple and they refused me. But she said, if I was a single mother, then I can get help.
Don't you see how backwards our system is? She said that they were married and they filed for welfare and they didn't get it. But if she was a single mother, she would have. Don't you see how this system has been created to lead to the destruction of the poor in this land, to keep them permanently poor?
So you really provide a disincentive for marriage, and you wonder why you get it. You get more of what you reward and less of what you punish. And so over those decades, we have punished single parent households. The more you work, the more in other words, the more you work, the more the perverse incentives for you. If I work and get a raise, I'm going to lose childcare. So that's why we have a system that disincentivizes work and marriage.
And you had certain politicians that would use that, but they would spin it for votes. Oh, we're paying poor women to have kids. You would hear that in political speeches. Right. I'm going to change that. We're paying poor women to have kids. And it made it sound like that the poor women were the problem. Right. That they're just taking advantage of it. You know, when you go back and what you're talking about, I think it's important to look at Lyndon Johnson and remember when they were saying the Great Society, it was Great Society for who? Because the government was our government has been actually pretty bad at getting Americans to move and change. They're pretty good at getting us upset, but they really don't get Americans, if you look at history, to really move and change. Our government has never really led, but our government has been excellent at being a catalyst of where they want us to go and to let us go. And to your point, they create this catalyst. You know, what they say with explosive, the explosive isn't the problem, it's the catalyst you put in the explosive. So always keep those guys separate. Government has been the catalyst. And what you're talking about is what they did is they knew what they were doing. And they knew that these things would be a catalyst of changing behavior because they couldn't stand at the pulpit of government and demand that you change, but they could put things out there and sit back and watch. And that's what you're saying.
Right, but I also realize that the question is, what are solutions? Mm-hmm. If you say that 70% of those families are raising children that are not dropping out of school, it means 30% are not. What we do at the Woodson Center is we go into low-income communities and we go into the homes of the 30% to find out what is going on in those households. These are people who are raising children that are not dropping out of school, they're not in jail, they're not on drugs. They are confronted with the same economic circumstances, but and so the question is, what is it that's going on there?
Right,
that's
not success leaves clues.
Success.
Yes.
So that's why I fault conservatives also, is that they have been preoccupied when it comes to poverty, but only studying failure.
That's so true. I agree with Dr. Woodson there. That's why it's an issue that both parties are somewhat at fault for, because neither party is looking to provide solutions. They're constantly pointing the finger at the failure. The Democrats say the failure is a result of the system. The Republicans say the failure is a result of the people not wanting to work. But no one looks at the other side of the coin, the ones that are being successful. No one says, what are they doing right so we can encourage that behavior to more and more families, to more and more people? Nobody looks at that because there's no profit off of that. Democrats can profit by saying that the country is systemically racist. Republicans can profit by saying that these people are lazy, these people are a leech to our society. No one wants to solve the issue. They keep punting it down the field.
Murray and some of the others, all they do is talk about, okay, if people on welfare, let's take away the perverse incentives. I'm for work requirements. I'm for drug testing, but you can't stop there. What we do at the Woodson Center is that we go look for capacity. And so many of the people in the 30%, we need to hold them up and take what works for the 30% and expand it to the 70%. And that's what we do. But it's a moral and spiritual crisis, and it is not an economic and social crisis. But policy, be the left or right of center, takes very little into account of restoration, moral redemption, faith. And many of our groups who have been able to survive under the worst of circumstances is because of their faith. But the whole issue of faith is not even a factor in supporting people's restoration. We have gone into some of the most drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods where there were 53 gang murders in the 5 square block area in 2 years, 25 years ago in D.C. We supported 5 young men who were ex-offenders who came to Christ and became redeemed. But they had the moral authority and the social trust of their peers. And so they went into these neighborhoods and brought the leadership of these kids who were doing destructive things. And they became agents of remoralization of these kids. And it's just like in the marketplace, only 3% of the people are entrepreneurs. They generate 70% of the jobs, right? Well, a lot of these organizations are social entrepreneurs. It only takes a small number of them, if you can change them and make them an agents of a restoration, they can change a whole community. And we found that to be the case in this community called Benning Terrace, by just going in and reaching 16 kids who were leading predators and changing their values and their attitudes.
How do you do that?
By witnessing to them. You take some man who has been in jail, who has faced all the challenges from an abused household, and saying, you are not defined by the worst of what you were. And I'm a witness that you don't have to stay there because you've been there.
Where did this self-help mindset come to you? Where did this self-help mindset come?
By looking at what we did in the past. In other words, what I've done by learning, if our people could, in the face of slavery and discrimination, build families and restore their communities, then all we've got to do is go back and take the values that served the interest of our people then and apply them today. In other words, taking old values and apply them to new realities with the consequence that you can. But a witness is more powerful than an advocate, and experience will always prevail against an argument. I debated this with Hawk Newman. It's on YouTube for 1 hour. I didn't argue with him. I confronted his proposition with my facts and saying, if we were able to learn and close the education gap under segregation, why can't we do it today?
Wow, that was a great interview with Dr. Woodson. I'll put the link to that entire chat in the description. But the main point I want to mention is that Dr. Woodson made some excellent points. That when in the height of segregation and the height of discrimination and the height of true oppression, Black people were able to thrive. So therefore, it's not a race problem. It's not an issue with white supremacy. The issue is because fathers have been pulled from the homes. It's because social engineering has taken place to systematically destroy the Black community, that faith and God has been driven out of the black community, the community is in shambles. That's why it takes all of us to bring the community back to the standards that were in place before, to the ideals that were in place before. That we're not victims, we are empowered for greatness.